Imagine waking up to a world on fire. This was the reality in 9th century England. Entire kingdoms were just gone. Villages burned, monasteries lay in ruins, and the sound of enemy axes echoed across the land. England was on the brink of vanishing forever. In the midst of this chaos sat a young, sickly king named Alfred. He was weak, constantly hunted, and underestimated by everyone. He could hear his kingdom dying, the screams, the chaos, the distant bells tolling for the dead. He faced an impossible choice: surrender and watch his people be wiped from history, or fight for a nation that might not even survive to remember his name. This wasn't a story of glorious battles, but of quiet grit, clever strategy, and the unglamorous work of survival. It's the incredible true story of how one man, against all odds, saved a nation from extinction. You are standing in a land that is about to disappear, not conquered, not defeated, simply erased. The year is 878, and England does not exist the way you imagine it. Villages burn without record, monasteries fall in silence, books rot in ash. The people do not know they are living at the edge of extinction, but one man does. Sick, hunted, betrayed, and hiding in a swamp, a king listens to the sound of his kingdom dying. This is not the story of a conqueror, this is the story of survival. And it begins when Alfred has already lost everything. England in the 9th century is not united. It is a fragile patchwork of small kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, with its own kings, loyalties, and fears. And against them comes something terrifyingly new: the Vikings, not raiders who come and go, but settlers who stay. They arrive with families, laws, and an appetite for land. The great heathen army does not negotiate, it consumes. By the time Alfred becomes king of Wessex in 871, 3 English kingdoms have already collapsed. Northumbria is gone. East Anglia is ruled by Vikings. Mercia is broken. Wessex stands alone, and Alfred is not ready. He is young. He is sickly. He suffers from a mysterious illness that strikes without warning, twisting his insides with pain. He cannot fight for long. He cannot ride endlessly. He cannot inspire confidence the way warrior kings are expected to. And worst of all, he inherits a war he did not start and cannot escape. The Vikings do not see Alfred as great. They see him as the last obstacle. Battles come fast. Some Alfred wins. Many he does not. Viking warbands move like storms, fast, brutal, unpredictable. They know the rivers, the coasts, the weaknesses. English armies still fight like the old world, slow to gather, slower to respond. One defeat means entire regions lost. Then comes the winter of 878. The Vikings strike when kings usually rest. Guthrum, their leader, launches a surprise attack deep into Wessex. Alfred is caught unprepared. His forces scatter. Noblemen defect. Strongholds fall. The royal court collapses almost overnight. Alfred does not retreat in glory. He runs. For weeks, he disappears into the marshes of Uthal-Nuit, cold, unforgiving land where even soldiers hesitate to follow. This is where legend strips him of dignity. He hides among peasants. He begs for food. He burns cakes in a poor woman's hut, distracted by thoughts of a kingdom he may never see again. A king reduced to a rumor. To the Vikings, England is finished. To Alfred, this is clarity, because in the mud and silence of exile, Alfred realizes something devastatingly simple. England will not be saved by winning one battle. It will be saved by changing everything. What Alfred understands, what no English king before him truly grasped, that the Vikings are not just stronger fighters. They are better organized, faster, more flexible. They adapt. And if England does not adapt too, it will vanish, not in a dramatic collapse, but in slow cultural death. Language replaced, laws overwritten, memory erased. So Alfred begins rebuilding, not an army but a system. Quietly, messengers go out. Loyal men gather in secret. Not knights and heroes, but farmers, minor lords, survivors. Alfred studies Viking tactics obsessively. He learns when they move, how they supply themselves, how they settle. He stops thinking like a desperate king and starts thinking like a strategist. When Alfred finally emerges from the marshes, it is not for revenge, it is for survival. At Edington, the two worlds collide. Alfred's forces are still smaller, still weaker on paper, but now they are disciplined, positioned, prepared. When the fighting ends, Guthrum is defeated, not destroyed, but broken enough to negotiate. And here is where Alfred does something unheard of. He does not execute Guthrum, he baptizes him. This is not mercy, it is strategy. Alfred understands that conversion is conquest by other means. By forcing Guthrum into Christian kingship, Alfred reshapes the conflict. Vikings are no longer faceless enemies. They are rulers bound by law, territory, and agreement. England does not win the war. England survives it, but Alfred is not finished. He knows another truth. Swords alone cannot save a people. Memory must survive too. Alfred looks around his kingdom and sees devastation not just in land, but in minds. Monasteries destroyed, Latin forgotten, laws inconsistent, knowledge fragmented. A people who cannot read their past cannot defend their future. So Alfred does something no warrior king has ever prioritized. He educates. He translates books into Old English so common people can read them. He reforms laws to blend justice with mercy. He reorganizes military defense with fortified townsburghs that make sudden Viking attacks nearly impossible. He builds a navy because he understands the sea is the real battlefield. Slowly, quietly, England changes, not into an empire, not into a myth, into something that can endure. When Alfred dies in 899, England is still fragile. Vikings still exist. Danger still looms. But something irreversible has happened. England has a shared identity, a language, a legal tradition, a memory. Without Alfred, England does not evolve. It dissolves. He is not remembered because he conquered the Vikings. He is remembered because he stopped England from disappearing. And history rarely rewards men who prevent disasters instead of creating them. The year is 878. Alfred, King of Wessex, has just won the Battle of Edington. But victory doesn't feel like victory. Smoke still hangs heavy in the air, a funeral shroud over ruined villages. The fields, once green and full of life, lie barren and untended. A chill runs deeper than the winter cold. It's the fear that the Vikings will be back. They always come back. Alfred knows this better than anyone. One battle, no matter how decisive, doesn't end an entire age of terror. It only buys time. And Alfred, a king pushed to the very edge of his kingdom, understands that time is now his most powerful weapon. The treaty that follows is a bitter pill for many to swallow. It looks like surrender. Alfred agrees to divide the land. The north and east of England are left under Viking rule, a territory that would become known as the England is officially broken. But Alfred's choice is not one of weakness. It's one of brutal realism. A kingdom that is broken but breathing is far better than one that is united and dead. He then does something few leaders are willing to do. He studies his enemy with an unflinching, uncomfortable honesty. He sees that the Vikings don't win through sheer luck. They win through speed, through coordination, and through an unnerving ability to establish control wherever they land. Their settlements aren't just temporary camps. They are living, breathing systems with laws, courts, and families. Alfred accepts a truth that other kings had denied. The Vikings aren't leaving. So, England must learn to live alongside them without being completely swallowed. His first move is not a glorious cavalry charge, but something far more mundane. He builds a network of fortified towns called burhs. These are not grand castles, but simple, practical defenses. Walls, ditches, and garrisons, all strategically placed about a day's march apart across Wessex. They are designed to be boring, predictable, and incredibly effective. Suddenly, a Viking raiding party can't just strike and vanish before an army arrives. Now, every road leads to resistance. Every raid becomes a costly, grinding effort. This single, tedious innovation changes the nature of warfare in England forever. Defense becomes organized. Next, Alfred reorganizes the army itself. Traditionally, the Anglo-Saxon fyrd was made up of farmers who would leave their fields for war, but had to return for planting and harvesting. The Vikings knew this rhythm and exploited it brilliantly. Alfred shatters that tradition. He creates a rotating system. Half the army remains on active duty, while the other half tends to the farms. War no longer has to pause for the harvest. Survival, he understood, couldn't afford to stick to the old ways. But Alfred knows that walls and soldiers are useless if the people's loyalty crumbles again. The kingdom is a chaotic patchwork of local customs, inconsistent punishments, and justice driven more by vengeance than fairness. So Alfred does something radical. He writes the law down. He gathers the old laws of the Anglo-Saxons, combines them with biblical principles and regional customs, and forges them into a single, comprehensive legal code. It isn't perfect, and it isn't always equal, but it is stable. For the first time in a long time, people know what to expect. Order, slowly and almost invisibly, begins to return. Yet, Alfred sees an even deeper, more insidious problem. A kingdom without a memory cannot withstand pressure, and England's memory was being systematically erased. The monasteries, once the great libraries and schools of the age, were now smouldering ruins. Priests could barely read the Latin of the services they were supposed to lead. Officials couldn't understand the legal documents they inherited. In a letter, Alfred wrote with deep frustration that where there were once countless learned men in England, now there were almost none. The nation was suffering from collective amnesia. So, he embarks on his most ambitious project, rebuilding the very mind of his kingdom. He commissions the translation of the most essential texts of the era: history, philosophy, theology, and practical guides for rulers, not into Latin for the elite, but into Old English, the language of the common people. This isn't a cultural vanity project. It's national infrastructure. Language itself becomes a weapon against erasure. For the first time in its history, English identity is being written in English. And Alfred doesn't just delegate this task. Between bouts of a mysterious, lifelong illness, between war councils and strategic planning, the king himself sits hunched over manuscripts, translating. A king, with enemies still circling his borders, acting as a scribe. It's an almost absurd image, and it is absolutely revolutionary. The effects are not immediate, but they are profound. Officials become literate. Laws are applied more consistently. Ideas, once trapped within monastery walls, begin to spread. The people of Mercia, of Wessex, of Kent, they begin to think of themselves as part of something shared, something that transcends the rule of a single king. They begin to think of themselves as English. Even Alfred's use of religion is strategic. He promotes Christianity not just as a matter of personal faith, but as a tool for national unity. When Viking leaders convert, their treaties are no longer just political promises. They are sacred oaths. Breaking them now risks not just war, but eternal damnation. Still, the peace remains fragile. Viking ships continue to appear on the horizon. New warlords arrive, eager to test Alfred's new defenses. Some of their attacks succeed. There are losses, but the system holds. The burghs stand firm. The rotating army responds. England is no longer just reacting blindly. It's anticipating. As Alfred grows older, his health worsens. The constant pain that plagued him throughout his life intensifies. Some days he can't ride. Some days he can barely eat. But his mind remains a razor. He isn't planning for the rest of his reign. He's planning for the next one. He trains his children, especially his son Edward, not as glorious conquerors, but as careful caretakers of the system he has built. This is the quiet genius of Alfred. He creates something that can function without him. When later generations call him Alfred the Great, they probably imagine him charging into battle, sword held high. But Alfred's true greatness is largely invisible. It's found in administrative charts, in fortified road networks, in translated books, and in consistent laws. It's the boring, unglamorous work that no saga ever celebrates, that no poet bothers to sing about. And yet, it's these things that stop a people from disappearing from the pages of history. By the time Alfred dies, England is still a threatened nation. It is still incomplete. It is still fragile, but it is no longer dying. It has a skeleton now. It has structure, memory, and a burgeoning sense of identity. The Vikings are still a powerful force, but England has learned the art of endurance. And endurance, as Alfred understood so well, is a form of victory that history often forgets. The kingdom breathes, and for the first time in a generation, it is planning for tomorrow. As Alfred grows older, the war around him changes shape. The Vikings do not vanish, they adapt, just as he has. Raids become smarter, leaders learn English defenses, treaties are tested, bent, broken. England's survival now depends not on moments of brilliance, but on whether Alfred's system can withstand pressure without his constant presence. This is where most kingdoms fail. A strong ruler creates stability, but the moment he weakens, everything collapses. Alfred understands this danger intimately. His illness reminds him daily that time is limited, so he begins preparing England, not for war, but for continuity. The greatest threat is not Viking swords, it is succession. Alfred's own childhood was shaped by instability. He watched brothers die, kings fall, alliances crumble. He knows that a poorly prepared heir can undo decades of survival in months. So Alfred trains Edward relentlessly, not in glory, but in patience. Edward learns law before battle, administration before ambition, defense before expansion. This choice frustrates nobles who crave revenge and conquest. They want England to strike back, to reclaim lost lands immediately. Alfred resists them. Expansion invites collapse. England must harden before it grows. Meanwhile, Alfred strengthens the Burr network. Roads connect towns. Supply lines improve. Messages travel faster. England begins to function like a coordinated organism, rather than scattered limbs. The Vikings find fewer weaknesses to exploit. Every failure teaches Alfred something new, but peace remains an illusion. In the 890s, a new wave of Viking forces arrives, larger, better equipped, more aggressive. These are not settlers seeking land, they are warriors seeking dominance. England faces its greatest test since Alfred's exile. This time, Alfred does not hide. The defenses hold. Burhs withstand sieges. Armies respond quickly. Alfred coordinates movement with precision that would have been impossible 20 years earlier. Losses occur, but the system endures. For the first time, Viking forces are forced to retreat, not because they are defeated, but because England is too difficult to break. This is a quiet turning point in history. The Viking Age does not end here, but its dominance in England begins to fade. Alfred watches this, not with triumph, but with caution. Victory breeds complacency. He warns his people that survival is ongoing, that systems must be maintained, that knowledge must be preserved, that identity is fragile. He doubles down on education. Alfred invites scholars from abroad. He funds schools. He insists that officials be literate. He understands something profound. Violence destroys bodies, but ignorance erases cultures. England begins to produce written records again. Chronicles resume. Laws are copied. Memory returns. And memory, once restored, becomes resistance. Yet Alfred remains human. He makes compromises. He tolerates injustice. His laws favor elites. His vision of unity is Christian, leaving little room for difference. History will not excuse these flaws, but it must understand them. Alfred is not building a modern nation. He is preventing a medieval one from vanishing. As death approaches, Alfred becomes more reflective. He writes, not as a king, but as a man aware of his limits. He speaks of wisdom as restraint, of leadership as responsibility rather than glory, of fear as a tool, not a weakness. When Alfred dies in 899, there is no explosion of chaos. That alone is his greatest success. Edward takes the throne smoothly. The burhs remain staffed. The laws continue to function. The army responds to threats. For the first time in generations, England transitions power without implosion. The Vikings test Edward immediately, and the system holds. Slowly, under Alfred's children and grandchildren, England begins reclaiming territory, not through reckless war, but steady pressure. The Danelaw shrinks. Viking rulers become English kings. Language blends. Culture merges. This is not conquest. It is absorption. Alfred does not live to see this, but he makes it possible. Centuries later, people will remember Alfred as the Great. Statues will depict him as a warrior, a sword in hand, eyes fierce. But the truth is quieter. Alfred's real weapon was patience. His battlefield was administration. His legacy was survival. England did not triumph loudly. It endured. And in a world where most early medieval kingdoms vanished without a trace, endurance is greatness. After Alfred's death, history does something cruel and familiar. It moves on. Wars continue. Kings rise and fall. Names blur. And for a time, it almost forgets the man who made survival possible in the first place. Edward rules not as a hero, but as a continuation. That is exactly what Alfred intended. The burhs remain manned. The roads stay repaired. Laws are enforced. Literacy spreads quietly through courts and churches. England does not fracture under pressure. It tightens. The Vikings, now deeply rooted in the land, face a different reality. Raiding has become inefficient. Settlements depend on trade and stability. Violence threatens their own families now. What Alfred foresaw begins to happen. Enemies become neighbors. But this transition is not peaceful. Skirmishes flare. Alliances shift. Cultural friction simmers. English and Danish laws clash. Languages mix awkwardly. Alfred's system is strained but not shattered. Edward pushes carefully north, not with sweeping invasions, but incremental pressure. Each reclaimed territory is fortified, administered, educated. The lesson of Alfred's reign holds. Expansion without structure invites collapse. What makes Alfred's legacy remarkable is not that it survives, but that it adapts. The burhs evolve into towns. Markets grow around them. Trade routes form. Defense becomes economy. Economy becomes community. England begins to look less like a battlefield and more like a place people intend to live long term. This is a radical transformation for the 9th and 10th centuries. Yet Alfred himself begins to fade from living memory. New victories claim attention. New kings earn praise. The everyday stability he built is taken for granted. People remember dramatic battles, not the systems that prevent them. This is the danger of quiet greatness. Monks continue Alfred's chronicle, but they struggle. Records are lost. Fires destroy libraries. Invasions resume elsewhere. England survives, but memory is always fragile. Still, Alfred's influence hides in plain sight. The English language continues to develop because Alfred insisted knowledge belonged to the people, not just the church. Legal traditions persist because he wrote them down. Kings rule with restraint because Alfred framed leadership as service, not dominance. Even the idea of England as a single entity owes its existence to Alfred's refusal to let it fragment completely. Without him, the land would not be unified later. It would be divided, absorbed, forgotten. Centuries later, when England faces new threats, Normans, internal wars, religious upheaval, Alfred's framework remains underneath the chaos, modified, stretched, but present. Only then do historians begin to look back and realize something unsettling. Alfred was not great because he won. He was great because he prevented loss so total that no victory would have mattered. Most medieval kings are remembered for what they conquered. Alfred is remembered for what did not happen. England did not disappear. That kind of greatness is difficult to celebrate. There is no single moment, no dramatic climax, just a series of choices that slowly narrow the path to extinction until survival becomes possible. Modern audiences struggle with this. We want heroes who charge forward, not kings who build warehouses, translate books, and organize tax systems. But history knows better. Civilizations die not from a single blow, but from neglect, disunity, and forgetting who they are. Alfred fought all three. By the time chroniclers begin calling him the Great, centuries have passed. The title is not official. It grows from comparison. Other kings fade. Alfred endures. His story becomes symbolic. The sick king who refused to give up. The scholar warrior who valued books as much as swords. The ruler who understood that survival requires humility. But myth smooths him, makes him simpler, cleaner. The truth is more uncomfortable. Alfred compromised. He tolerated inequality. He used religion as power. He ruled in a violent age and made violent decisions. He is not a modern hero. He is a necessary one. And perhaps that is why his story resonates quietly across centuries. Because every society eventually faces a moment where survival is not guaranteed, where identity trembles, where erasure feels possible. And in those moments, salvation rarely comes from brilliance alone. It comes from patience, from systems, from people willing to do the unglamorous work of holding things together while everything else tries to fall apart. Alfred understood that, and because he did, England remains not as a conquest, but as a continuity, still breathing, still remembered. As generations pass, Alfred becomes less a man and more an idea. This is how history preserves what it cannot fully explain. His real achievements, administration, education, restraint are too quiet to survive unchanged. So later England reshapes him, polishing rough edges, sharpening symbols, turning complexity into legend. The transformation begins slowly. Monks writing centuries later search for origins, for a moment when England first became itself. Alfred fits the need. He is safe, Christian, educated, victorious enough. They elevate him not to distort history, but to give it structure. In doing so, they almost lose the truth. Stories grow. Alfred the scholar becomes Alfred the warrior scholar. His patience becomes cunning. His compromises become victories. The marsh exile turns into moral parable. Burning cakes becomes a lesson in humility. Each detail simplifies a reality that was far messier. But myth has power. By the High Middle Ages, Alfred is one of the few early kings people can name. His laws are cited. His image appears in chronicles as a unifier. England's identity leans backward toward him, anchoring itself in a moment of survival rather than conquest. Ironically, this admiration grows strongest when England feels most threatened. During times of invasion, rebellion, or internal collapse, writers return to Alfred. They see in him a model. A ruler who faced extinction and did not panic, who reformed instead of raging, who built rather than destroyed. Yet the danger of myth is amnesia. People begin to believe England was always destined to survive, that Alfred merely fulfilled fate, that Viking conquest was inevitable but manageable, that the outcome was assured. It was not. Archaeology tells a harsher story. Whole regions depopulated, churches erased, literacy nearly extinct, language on the brink of replacement. England in the 9th century was one failed campaign away from cultural absorption. Without Alfred's refusal to surrender identity, the English language might not exist as we know it. Law might have evolved under entirely different systems. England might have become a memory inside another culture's story. This is the truth the myth hides. Alfred did not save a nation destined for greatness. He saved a fragile people whose future was uncertain. As England grows more powerful in later centuries, it forgets this vulnerability. Empire replaces survival. Expansion replaces endurance. Alfred's restraint becomes less fashionable. His patience seems small compared to conquest. And yet, his influence remains embedded in institutions. The idea that law stands above kings, that rulers serve a common good, that education is essential to governance, these principles, radical in Alfred's time, become foundational. Even England's later conflicts, civil wars, religious schisms are fought within a framework Alfred helped normalize. Written law, documented rights, shared identity. Still, Alfred nearly disappears again. By the early modern period, attention shifts to newer heroes. Alfred is mentioned, respected, but distant. His era feels too primitive, too far removed. It takes crisis to resurrect him. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Britain faces questions of identity, empire, and national character, Alfred returns forcefully. Statues rise, textbooks praise him. He is recast as the father of England, the origin point of British greatness. This version of Alfred is cleaner than reality, more confident, more dominant, but the reason he is chosen remains revealing. At moments when England fears decline, fragmentation, or loss of moral direction, Alfred's story becomes useful again, not because he conquered, but because he preserved. The deeper truth persists beneath the myth. Greatness does not always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like holding the line long enough for something fragile to grow stronger. Alfred's life was not triumphant. It was exhausting. He ruled while sick. He governed while hunted. He rebuilt while surrounded by enemies. He compromised when pride demanded revenge. He planned for a future he would not live to see. That kind of leadership rarely inspires songs, but it shapes centuries. England did not become England in a single moment. It survived long enough to become itself. And that survival traces back to a man who understood that disappearance is often quieter than defeat. Alfred did not stop time. He bought it, and time did the rest. Long after Alfred the Great's bones turned to dust, his ideas continued walking through England. They shape the country even now, unnoticed by people who have never heard his name. This is how real influence works. It doesn't announce itself. It embeds. Think about it. Before Alfred, power in England was personal. Loyalty belonged to a lord, a chieftain, an individual. But Alfred changed the game. He built a system where power became institutional. Kings would come and go. Dynasties would rise and fall. But the laws, the towns, the very idea of England would persist. How did he do it? It wasn't one dramatic conquest. It was a slow, almost invisible revolution. It was built burr by burr, law by law, agreement by agreement. What started as a desperate network of fortified towns for emergency defense slowly became the backbone of normal life. Markets stabilized, trade grew, literacy, once confined to monasteries, began to spread. For the first time, people started to think of themselves not just as subjects of a lord, but as members of a shared land as English. This shift is subtle, but it's everything. When you have a system, you have continuity. When you have written laws, you have a way to settle disputes without constant bloodshed. When you translate important texts into the common language, you empower people with knowledge. Alfred insisted on all these things when they seemed like luxuries in a time of war. He knew they were necessities for survival. He was fighting against total cultural erasure by the Vikings. And what happened? The Danelaw, the Viking-controlled part of England, didn't vanish because the Vikings were all expelled. It shrank because they integrated. Danish leaders adopted English customs. English leaders absorbed Scandinavian practices. The threat of erasure transformed into cultural evolution. This was only possible because Alfred had built a framework strong enough to absorb this difference without collapsing. This resilience was tested again and again. Centuries later, when the Norman conquest arrived, England was conquered, but it was not erased. The system bent, but it didn't break. The Normans took over a pre-existing kingdom with its own laws, language, and identity. That structure, that internal coherence, was Alfred's deepest legacy. Many other cultures, when conquered by a stronger power, vanish within a few generations. England did not. It survived because survival had been practiced for centuries. Alfred's belief that kingship was a responsibility, not just a right to dominate, slowly seeped into the political culture. Rulers were expected to protect their people. When they failed, resistance wasn't just chaos. It often formed around established laws and customs. This isn't democracy as we know it, but it's the seed of accountability. The idea that no ruler is above the system. This is why celebrating Alfred can be tricky. History loves to remember the flashy conquerors. Their impact is easy to see: borders change, cities fall. Alfred's impact is in the continuity, in what did not fall, in the culture that was not erased. How do you dramatize patience? How do you glorify the slow, grinding work of building institutions? But that's the true weight of his legacy. He stood at the edge of his world's disappearance and chose endurance. He didn't create the England of today, or the British Empire, or a modern democracy. He never imagined any of that. What he created was England's ability to become anything at all. He ruled not to dominate history, but to give it time to unfold. And that time, once he had secured it, proved to be more powerful than any army. Centuries after Alfred, England no longer remembers the fear that once defined its existence. This is the paradox of survival. When it succeeds, the danger fades from memory. The people living in a stable land rarely imagine how close that stability once came to vanishing. And yet, Alfred's story continues to whisper beneath England's confidence, resurfacing whenever the illusion of permanence cracks. History is full of vanished cultures' names, known only through fragments, languages preserved only in footnotes. Alfred lived in a moment when England hovered on the brink of becoming one of them. Not conquered in a dramatic collapse, but absorbed so thoroughly that its identity would dissolve quietly. This kind of disappearance is the most common in history. It does not arrive with fire and screaming alone. It arrives through neglect, fragmentation, and forgetting who you are. Alfred understood this instinctively. He did not fight merely for territory. He fought for continuity, for memory, for a future in which people could still recognize themselves. What makes Alfred unusual is not that he faced extinction many rulers did, but that he recognized it early enough to respond intelligently. Most leaders cling to tradition when the world changes. Alfred let tradition bend. That decision echoes far beyond his lifetime. Every time England reinvents itself politically, culturally, linguistically, it does so within a framework Alfred helped stabilize. Reform becomes possible because collapse was avoided. Change occurs because identity survived. This pattern repeats across history. Societies that endure are not those that resist change entirely, but those that protect their core while adapting their form. Alfred's England was one of the earliest examples of this truth. He preserved language by making it accessible. He preserved law by writing it down. He preserved leadership by redefining it as responsibility. None of these actions are dramatic in isolation. Together, they form a defense stronger than walls. Even the Vikings, once symbols of annihilation, become proof of Alfred's success. They integrate, they influence culture without erasing it. Their descendants become English. Their language leaves traces. Their gods fade, but their people remain. This outcome was not victory through dominance. It was victory through absorption. Alfred's approach contrasts sharply with the heroic ideal that dominates historical storytelling. He did not seek immortality. He sought survival. He accepted imperfection. He compromised when compromise preserved life. Modern audiences often misunderstand this. We prefer stories of triumph. Alfred offers something harder, a lesson in restraint. Restraint is uncomfortable. It feels like weakness. It requires patience, humility, and the acceptance that you may never see the results of your labor. Alfred embodied all of this. He ruled knowing his health would fail. He built systems knowing others would inherit them. He accepted obscurity in exchange for continuity. In this sense, Alfred is not just an English figure. He is a universal one. Every culture that survives a near-death moment has its Alfred's people who choose preservation over pride, structure over spectacle, memory over revenge. Most of them are forgotten. Alfred is remembered only because England later became powerful enough to look back. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many civilizations vanished because they lacked someone willing to do what Alfred did? We celebrate conquerors because they change maps, but those who prevent erasure rarely leave visible marks. Their success is measured in absence in disasters that did not happen. Alfred's England could have become a footnote. Instead, it became a foundation. That foundation carried through centuries of conflict, expansion, and transformation. It survived invasions, civil wars, religious upheaval, and industrial change, not because it was invincible, but because it was adaptable. Alfred did not guarantee England's future. He made it possible, and that distinction matters, because it reminds us that history is not shaped only by those who push forward aggressively, but by those who hold steady when everything threatens to fall apart. The greatest threat to a civilization is not always an enemy at the gate. Sometimes it is the belief that survival is automatic. Alfred never believed that, and because he did not, England endured. The older England becomes, the harder it is to imagine itself fragile. Power rewrites memory. Stability convinces people it was always inevitable. But history is never inevitable, and Alfred's story exists to quietly contradict that comforting lie. When later generations look back, they often mistake continuity for destiny. They assume England survived because it was meant to, because it was strong, because its people were exceptional. Alfred's life exposes how dangerous that thinking is. England did not survive because it was powerful. It survived because, at its weakest moment, someone chose to act differently. This truth makes Alfred uncomfortable as a symbol. He reminds us that collapse is the default, not the exception. Most cultures do not make it. Most identities dissolve into something else. Survival requires deliberate effort. Alfred ruled during a time when disappearance felt normal. Whole kingdoms vanished within a generation. Names faded. Languages died. The Vikings themselves would later face this fate in many regions. No group is immune. Alfred's response to this reality was not defiance alone, but preparation. He did not trust courage to save England. He trusted systems. Systems are boring. They require maintenance. They fail quietly. They demand patience. This is why they are often neglected until it is too late. Alfred refused neglect. He treated survival as work, not destiny. Education had to be rebuilt. Law had to be clarified. Defense had to be constant. Identity had to be shared. None of these tasks were glorious. All of them were necessary. This is why Alfred fits the idea of boring history so perfectly. His greatness lives in logistics, translation, administration, and long-term thinking. These things do not inspire immediate awe. They inspire longevity. As England moved through centuries of change, Alfred's influence faded in form, but remained in function. Even when his name disappeared from common memory, his priorities survived embedded in institutions. When England faced later existential threats for an invasion, internal fracture, economic collapse, responded not as a loose collection of tribes, but as a society with shared mechanisms. This difference is everything. Societies without systems panic. Societies with systems adapt. Alfred's England adapted repeatedly. That does not mean it was just or kind or peaceful. Survival is not morality. Alfred's laws were unequal. His society was hierarchical. His vision excluded many. These realities matter, but survival comes before reform. You cannot improve what no longer exists. This harsh truth sits at the core of Alfred's legacy. He preserved a flawed society long enough for it to change itself. Many later improvements, legal rights, representative governance, cultural flourishing would have been impossible without the continuity Alfred secured. This is why judging Alfred solely by modern standards misses the point. His role was not to perfect England, it was to keep it alive, and he succeeded. History often celebrates beginnings and endings. Alfred's story lives in the middle, between collapse and recovery, between fear and confidence. It is a story of holding on. This makes it resonate across time. Every era has moments where identity feels threatened, where systems strain, where continuity is uncertain. Alfred's story offers no dramatic solution. It offers discipline. Build slowly, educate widely, prepare constantly, compromise strategically. Think beyond your lifetime. These lessons are not exciting. They are effective. Alfred did not know his name would survive. He did not know England would one day dominate continents. He acted under the assumption that failure was likely, and that assumption made his success possible. In the end, Alfred's greatness is not that he saved England alone. It is that he made survival ordinary. England did not endure because of constant heroism. It endured because the extraordinary became unnecessary. Walls held, Laws worked, people adapted, life continued, and sometimes that is the greatest achievement history can offer. When we think of medieval kings, we often picture epic battles and heroic charges. But what if the greatest king of all was not a warrior, but a thinker, a man whose true weapon was his mind, not his sword? Today, we're talking about Alfred the Great, the king who didn't just save England, but laid the very foundations for its future. Let's rewind to the 9th century. The land we now call England was a fractured collection of small kingdoms, and they were all under attack. Waves of Viking invaders, the great heathen army, were storming across the country, conquering kingdom after kingdom. Northumbria had fallen, East Anglia had fallen, Mercia was on its knees. Only one kingdom remained, Wessex, ruled by a young king named Alfred. In the year 878, things looked hopeless. Alfred was driven into hiding in the marshlands of Somerset. To the Vikings, it seemed like the final Anglo-Saxon kingdom was about to be extinguished. For any other leader, this would have been the end. But for Alfred, this was where the real work began. Hiding in the swamps, he wasn't just surviving, he was thinking. He was analyzing why his people kept losing. It wasn't a lack of courage, but a lack of structure. The Anglo-Saxon armies, the Third, were essentially part-time soldiers. They were farmers, called to fight when danger arose. They could put up a good fight for a short time, but they couldn't stay in the field indefinitely. They had harvests to bring in, families to feed. The Vikings, on the other hand, were a professional fighting force. They could campaign year-round. Alfred realized he wasn't just fighting an army, he was fighting a system. And to beat a system, you need a better one. So, while in hiding, Alfred started planning. He rallied his loyal followers, not for one last glorious charge, but for a new beginning. He emerged from the marshes and achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. This victory wasn't the end of the war, but the start of Alfred's grand project. He secured a peace treaty, known as the Treaty of Wedmore, which divided England. The north and east became the Danelaw under Viking rule, while Alfred controlled the south and west. Now, many kings would have stopped there, but Alfred knew this was just a ceasefire. The real war was against chaos, and the real victory would be creating a society that could withstand it. His genius was in realizing that military victory is temporary, but structural change is permanent. First, he revolutionized the army. He divided his Third into two groups. One group would be on active duty, defending the kingdom, while the other group stayed home, tending the farms. They would then rotate. This simple but brilliant idea meant Wessex now had a standing army, a professional defense force that could counter the Vikings on their own terms, without starving the kingdom. It was a game changer, but a mobile army wasn't enough. The Vikings were raiders. They were fast. Alfred needed a way to slow them down, to protect his people. His solution was a network of fortified towns called burhs. He ordered the construction of over 30 of these forts, strategically placed across his kingdom. No person would be more than 20 miles, about a day's march, from the safety of a burh. These weren't just military outposts, they were centers of community and commerce. They had planned street grids, markets, and a mint for coining money. They were designed to be self-sufficient and defensible. If the Vikings attacked, people from the surrounding countryside could retreat into the burh, and its garrison could hold them off until the mobile army arrived. It was a defense-in-depth system, and it worked beautifully. The Vikings, who relied on speed and surprise, found themselves bogged down in long, fruitless sieges. Wessex was no longer an easy target. It had become a fortress. But Alfred's vision went beyond military strategy. He knew that a strong kingdom needed more than just walls and soldiers. It needed a shared identity, a common culture. In a time when most of Europe was descending into the Dark Ages, Alfred sparked a renaissance of learning and literacy. He himself was a scholar. He learned Latin in his late 30s and was dismayed to find that knowledge and education had decayed so much during the wars. Priests could barely read the services they were meant to perform. Alfred believed that wisdom was as important as strength for the health of a nation. So, he initiated an ambitious educational program. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court. He established a court school to educate his own children and the sons of his nobles. And most importantly, he began a project to translate the most important books from Latin into Old English, the language of the common people. Works of history, philosophy, and theology were now accessible to anyone who could read. Alfred himself personally translated several books, adding his own thoughts and prefaces. Why was this so important? Because by giving his people a shared language of literature and ideas, he was forging a new identity. They were no longer just West Saxons or Mercians. They were becoming Angelchin, the English people. He was building a nation in their minds and hearts, not just on the map. He was laying the cultural groundwork for what would eventually become England. He also reformed the law. He gathered the old law codes of the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, studied them, and compiled a new, unified code of law for his people. He didn't just impose his own laws. He respected the traditions of the past, but adapted them for the present. His code emphasized justice, fairness, and Christian morality. It was another brick in the foundation of a unified, stable society. So, when you put it all together, what do you see? A military reformer who created a standing army, a master strategist who built a kingdom-wide defense network, a patron of learning who revived education and literature, a lawgiver who created a unified legal code. Alfred wasn't just reacting to crises, he was proactively building a system designed to prevent them. He was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. His long-term vision ensured that when he died in 899, his kingdom didn't crumble. The systems he put in place were so robust that his successors, his son Edward, and his daughter Telford, the Lady of the Mercians, were able to go on the offensive. They used the burhs as staging posts to systematically reconquer the Duola. By the mid-10th century, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, would become the first king to rule over a unified England. Alfred's legacy is all around us, even today. The idea of a national navy, a commitment to public education, a unified legal system, these concepts have roots in his reign. He was the only English monarch ever to be called the Great, and he earned it not through conquest or personal glory, but through tireless, intelligent, structural work. He saved his kingdom from destruction and, in the process, created the blueprint for a nation. So the next time you think about great leaders, remember Alfred. Remember the king who understood that true strength isn't just about winning battles. It's about building something that lasts. It's about having the vision to see not just the world as it is, but the world as it could be, and then doing the hard, patient work of making that vision a reality. At the end of Alfred's story, there is no triumphant finale, no final conquest, no moment where the world pauses to acknowledge what has been saved. History does not stop to applaud survival, it simply continues. This is the quiet truth Alfred lived with and accepted. He did not expect recognition. He did not build for legacy. He built because the alternative was disappearance. When he looked at England, he did not see destiny. He saw vulnerability. He saw how easily identity could dissolve, how quickly memory could vanish, how silently a people could be absorbed into someone else's story. And so he chose the least dramatic path. He chose endurance. Alfred never ruled a united England. He never drove the Vikings entirely from the land. He never witnessed the full results of his labor. His life ends not in triumph, but in transition. The future remains uncertain, even as he leaves it better prepared than he found it. That is the mark of his success. The England that survives him does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary. Towns function. Laws are enforced. People farm, trade, pray, argue, and live. Nothing about this looks legendary. But legend is not what keeps a civilization alive. What keeps it alive is continuity. Alfred understood that survival is not a single event, but a habit, one that must be practiced again and again, especially when nothing seems immediately wrong. He practiced it when England was burning. Later generations practiced it without realizing where the instinct came from. This is why Alfred the Great matters, not because he created England as it would become, but because he ensured there would be an England to become anything at all. Every society reaches moments like his, moments where identity feels threatened, where change accelerates faster than understanding, where old structures fail and new ones are not yet ready. In those moments, collapse feels easier than adaptation. Alfred chose adaptation. He did not cling blindly to tradition. He did not surrender to chaos. He reshaped what existed so it could survive what was coming. That balance between preservation and change is the rarest form of leadership. Alfred's story reminds us that disappearance is often quiet. Civilizations do not always fall in flames. They fade, they merge, they forget themselves. And survival, just as quietly, depends on people willing to notice that danger before it feels urgent. Alfred noticed. He noticed when literacy vanished, when law fragmented, when defense failed, when identity blurred. And instead of denying these problems, he addressed them piece by piece. No single decision saved England. The accumulation did. This is why Alfred's greatness resists simplification. It cannot be reduced to a battle or a speech. It lives in systems that outlasted him, in habits that became normal, in structures that endured long enough to evolve. England did not survive because Alfred was perfect. It survived because he was attentive, because he accepted uncertainty without surrendering responsibility, because he understood that the future is built not by bold promises, but by sustained effort. When we look back across centuries of English history, its triumphs and failures, its expansions and contractions, we are really looking at the long shadow of survival first secured in Alfred's time. Without that foundation, nothing else follows. No unity, no continuity, no memory, just silence. And so Alfred remains where history often places its most important figures, not at the center of glory, but at the edge of extinction, holding things together long enough for the world to move forward. He saved England not by conquering it, but by refusing to let it disappear. And sometimes, that is the greatest act history ever records, even if it takes centuries to understand why.